London, 58th DevOps Exchange London, which is amazing. So first of 2020 as well, so hope you had a great festive period and great to see you all back. Great audience as well, huge amount here. Two venues this month as well, so first of all, huge thanks to Hardeep and the team at WorldPay for their hard work in putting this together. And obviously we had an unprecedented amount of people register. So thanks to the guys at Lynch Creek for stepping in at the 11th hour and opening their doors as a second overspill venue. So I think we've got about 60 people there as well. A quick overview on the DevOps Exchange. So I think a lot of you probably know this already. It looks like a lot of familiar faces here and a lot of new people as well. But the DevOps Exchange London started about 6 years ago. I think we've just exceeded the 8,000 member mark, which is great. And we've got another 2,000 members split across the other 5 venues that we have. So the idea is we're looking to build a global community of localised DevOps events. What that means to you is all of our talks are live on our YouTube channel, including this one. So if you see a talk in Edinburgh or Barcelona or Manchester or any of the other new locations that we bring up, and you can't attend, it'll be live on YouTube. Also, if you're not already following us, follow us on Twitter. We have a hashtag as well, DevOps Exchange, or DOXLON, sorry. So if you want to give us a bit of feedback or share some photos or whatever, feel free to tell us how you feel on DOXLON. Agenda for today. So first of all, thanks very much for Slava for flying over, especially from Stockholm for today. So obviously Spotify are quite heavily referenced in general DevOps culture. So really interesting to hear about continuous delivery at Spotify. We'll then have a break for 15-20 minutes or so. The speakers will swap venues. And then Mark Newt from WorldPay will come along and give us 100 days of SRE at WorldPay. And I don't think I've ever heard a confident description of what SRE actually means, so I'm looking forward to that one. And obviously this is a community event. It's not a corporate thing at all, but we need people who can provide the refreshments and organise speakers and venues and that kind of thing. So first sponsor is Lynch Recruit. That's where I work. So we don't want to push the recruitment message at all because you would stop coming. But we are a recruitment company. We specialise in cloud and DevOps in particular. So if you want to come and have a chat about general market conditions, or if you're looking for a new job or looking to hire, then come and find one of the team in the DOXLON t-shirts. Second sponsor is WeShape, formerly Shape. If Jack wants to come and say a couple of words.
I'll say just a quick hello from WeShape as one of the sponsors. So we're a technology consultancy who focuses in the DevOps, cloud and agile space. So if you want to kind of have a chat with one of us around kind of outcome-based projects, come say hello. But yeah, enjoy the talks and have a great evening. And also WorldPay, someone from Richie from WorldPay, say a few words.
Yeah, thanks for coming along, everybody. It's a huge crowd. But yeah, in WorldPay here in London, actually, we're the biggest acquirer globally, so we're right at the heart of payments. We do anything from like your corner store to the biggest e-commerce websites globally, and yeah, we also have a DevOps practice, and as you'll see later on, we've also just stood up our SRE practice. So we're probably on maybe the other end of the scale from Spotify in terms of some of what we do. But I'll just pass it over to Rashi. She's been working with our DevOps practice here for quite a while.
Right, okay, hi everyone, lovely audience. I'm Rashi Saxena, I'm heading DevOps space. So what do we do? All cool stuff. So basically we develop all the tooling and configuration, administration of all the DevOps tooling, which basically help us to build, develop, deploy and deliver. So yeah, we'll talk about more of DevOps practices again in the SRE section, which Mark was going to be covering, and yeah, we'll pop up again. Yeah.
Great, and thanks again to the team at WorldPay for hosting us, really kind of them. And finally, afterwards, we will have a tab at a pub just around the corner. So after the talks are finished, there might be a few more drinks here, and then it's literally come out, turn left again, and it's there. So Lynch Creek will have a tab there, and both venues will join together. So yeah, I hope you have a great evening, enjoy the talks. There'll be time for questions after both talks as well. So yeah, without further ado, here's Slava. I just turned it off. Oh, there you go. Ooh, press on that.
Hello, how is the sound? Is it okay? Cool. So my name is Slava. I'm a software engineer at Spotify, and this talk is very creatively titled Continuous Delivery at Spotify. So I want to talk about two main things. First, I will describe a little bit of history that we had since Spotify was founded in 2006. We've grown a lot since then, and the tech has grown a lot. And also, I want to talk a little bit of how we do continuous delivery at my team, specifically. So we've set up a continuous delivery pipeline that makes us ship things as fast as possible. But I'm not going to try to recommend you any specific products, and I'm not going to try to sell you anything, because I'm sure you use Spotify already. So let's dive into history a little bit. It all started in 2006, and back in the days, it was pretty much startup culture. So I can move really fast. I maybe don't care so much about continuous delivery or anything, because we don't have any users yet, which is the most important. And this was before we had containers or anything like that. Everybody was running Debian on their workstations. And if you wanted to build a package, you maybe package it into a Debian dep package, and then if you want to run it on a server, you basically SSH to it on a physical server, and then run apt get install my service or something like that. Pretty basic, but it worked. And of course, it was a very small company, so the server you were deploying to was probably sitting behind your desk, maybe keeping your feet warm. Moving on to 2010. And this is just 4 years later, but we have a bit more users now, and things start to get more serious. We're still not as big as today. For example, we haven't launched in the US so far in 2010. So stuff is still mostly happening in Europe. We're still using Debian packages for packaging and deploying things. But we have some deployment infrastructure because we are more people, and manually installing things just doesn't scale. We have manual machine provisioning in 2010. So what it means is basically if you need to scale up your service, you maybe write a little form and buy some more machines and install everything in them manually. And the whole process might take days at very least. But we had DevOps as well in each team. I mean, it wasn't really called DevOps back in the days. It was pretty much like people who were working on the services were also responsible for maintaining the services and the machines they were running on, and the deployment of those services as well. So we had microservices everywhere back in 2010. And for us, it happened very naturally. I don't have any war stories of splitting a large monolith or something like that. There are pretty good ones out there, but for us, the way we organized our teams meant that people were focusing on the things they were working on. And they started building microservices quite naturally. Moving on to 2014. Now Spotify is like a proper global company, and the tech is starting to reflect that. We have containers everywhere to package and deploy services, and we have automatic machine provisioning in our data centers. So if your service would be running out of capacity, you would need to do some capacity planning forward, and then it's just a matter of writing a little web UI form, and then you get new VMs immediately. And everything is automatically configured with Puppet. So it's super fast and obviously automatic already. Then we also switched to GitHub Enterprise in 2014. We were a little bit late joining that party, but what they gave us is fancy post and pre-commit hooks. So we could trigger builds through GitHub, and everything was much cleaner that way. Finally, we started using something called Helios for container orchestration and deployment. And we also made it open source. In 2014, it was a bit of Wild West when it came to container orchestration and deployment. And every company was building their own container orchestration platform and open sourcing it. And Spotify was no different from that. So we built Helios, and we used it for managing our containers and deploying post-commit. We actually open sourced it on the same day when Kubernetes was announced. But now it's pretty clear who won that little race. Not that it was a race at all. Moving on, where we start to move away from Helios to something that is more an industry standard, of course, it's Kubernetes. And that brings us to 2020, today. And like I was just saying, Kubernetes is an industry standard today, so container orchestration today kind of equals Kubernetes. So we're switching from Helios to it slowly, and we've moved off on-premise data centers as well, as much as possible. Previously, we had a mix of AWS and some on-premise services, and now we moved to Google Cloud completely. And that gives us a lot of options for flexibility, obviously. Second point I had was real continuous delivery. And I wanted to describe how we do it in the team I work in. So how many of you know what that means? Cool, quite a lot. For those of you who don't know, Spotify Connect is a service feature in the app that allows you to transfer music from one device to another device. And this is done through backend, on the contrary of maybe cast protocols or something like this. So, for example, you might transfer your music from phone to your TV or to a smart speaker or to a Chromecast and to control it. So your devices act as a remote control for other devices that display music. And I work in infrastructure team for this. To give you an idea of the challenges we have more than 240 million monthly active users. And we need to store their playing state. And that means to store what they are playing now, what they are playing next. Are they shuffling? Are they not shuffling? And we need to distribute this state properly and accurately over all of their devices so that whatever devices are observing the playback would be seeing the accurate state of the device that is actually playing music right now. And we also have different backend services that depend on this infrastructure, like our web API and many other services as well. So we need to make sure that those services have proper data and it's accurate all the time. The reason I'm talking about it is because I want to tell you a little bit of the continuous delivery pipeline that we've set up to support this service. But I want to define some goals that we want to achieve with this continuous delivery, because continuous delivery itself is not a goal. It's, you don't aim for continuous delivery. You aim to get some value out of it. So it's like a tool. And I want to define some goals that I've listed on the next slide. So of course we want to trigger deploys post-merge automatically. And we don't want to have some manual interaction there. That's pretty standard. We don't want to package up a service and then go and manually press little buttons saying I want to deploy something. That's just many extra steps that make things slower. We don't want to have staging environment for this either. Staging environments that we have had in the past were not so convenient to work with, because you always have this problem. You have to spend time to make a staging environment reflect your production environment. And then you may use it to verify builds before they go into production. But the same time might be well spent for working on tests. So you don't need a staging environment at all. And that, I think, where we started shifting focus on, at least in Spotify Connect infrastructure team. So we are focusing to make tests better, and we don't need a staging environment, therefore. And lastly, we want really quick feedback times, because we do a lot of experiments across the company. And especially in my team, we like to deploy things really fast, so we don't have to switch focus from whatever we are working on to something else whilst it's deploying. And ideally, we want a turnaround time from merge to it being in production, something between 15 and 20 minutes. And that would allow us to really focus on actual work without having to switch focus on the previous deploys. To give you an idea how that works, I'm going to show you a part of the pipeline we use. This is pretty simple and starts with post-merge, as every post-merge pipeline does. Once we merge and GitHub triggers the hook then it triggers something in the post-merge pipeline in Jenkins. Then Jenkins will spawn off a number of different pipelines. For example, to build a container so that it's ready for testing. And then there is a number of different testing phases that, of course, we do for the services we own. We have basic unit tests. We have integration tests that use mocked upstreams. We have integration tests that use production upstreams. But then we've been experimenting a lot with a system tests layer, specifically for Spotify Connect. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it's cool. So if you imagine that you have a service A that's under test, and it has upstream dependencies, service B and service C. If you would run an integration test that would hit production versions of service B and C, then it's pretty simple. But what that doesn't test is how services that depend on service A would be affected by this new version of service A going into production. So, for example, it doesn't really check how service D would be affected by this new version of service A. And we were thinking about system tests for this. The reason, if it would be a huge problem, we would probably start thinking about contract testing, maybe, or something like that. The reason we're not doing it is because, first of all, it's not big enough of a problem, and secondly, we will have to sort of shackle all the teams into this contract testing environment, whilst we want to keep people free to iterate on whatever they are working on. So this works like this. Every service would have own integration tests anyway. And this tests just how a particular service integrates with the rest of the services in the system. So when we have a new version of service A in this example, let's call it snapshot version of service A. We will spin it up in Jenkins, and then we are ready to test it. The first thing that the system test pipeline does is it gets a test user from a test user pool. And this is another service, a test user pool service, which is responsible for owning a number of Spotify users, which are like real Spotify users, but set up specifically for testing. We can request a user from it and use it for maybe 10 minutes. And when we call a test user pool service, we get some user X, for example. And then we are ready to start running integration tests, which make calls from the perspective of user X specifically. So this would be making calls into the upstream services. And we run all the integration tests in the system test environment. So it's service A, service B, service C, service D integration tests. And if you see here, service D is actually calling the production version of service A. So what we did actually is to redirect all the traffic that service A in production receives for user X to the snapshot version of service A that is running in Jenkins. This way, the integration tests written for service D, when they call into service A, will be actually hitting the service A running in Jenkins that contains the code that we plan to deploy. And what we're actually doing here is kind of shadowing service A in production. It's not handling any production traffic for user X. All of this is being handled by Jenkins, by the new version of service A running in Jenkins. And this might be catching problems like to validate some assumptions which service D might have done about service A, which we didn't know about. And I think it's quite powerful. Moving on. We run all those tests, and we pass all those tests. So now we're ready to create a container that's ready to be deployed. And we start deploying it into Kubernetes, into a group of Canary pods, which sit in each site. So we have sites in the US, in Europe, and somewhere else. And we have a number of pods in Kubernetes for each of the services, of course. And we have special groups of those pods, which is called Canary group. When we deploy a new version of the service, this is the group of the pods which gets the new version first. And the reason we are doing it is to make sure that the new version in the Canary group is not doing worse than the production version running on the rest of the pods. But as I said, we don't want to have any manual interaction there. So we don't want to sit and compare metrics, something like this, and look at the graphs. So of course we wrote a service to automate this for us. And this is called Canary Analysis Service, and it pings us in Slack, which is pretty cool. So when we merge a new version of the service, it pings us in Slack and says, hey, I'm going to start to deploy my amazing service, and I'm going to do the analysis for maybe 10 minutes. And what it's actually doing is constantly checking the metrics for the Canary group versus the rest of the pods in production. And this might be some metrics that we defined as key metrics for a particular service, and we are verifying that Canary pods are not doing worse than non-Canary pods. If it finds some issues, it will ping us again, and will say, okay, my tests for my amazing service are failing. And it will roll it back soon if it doesn't recover. And in this particular example, it said that in site 2, which might be the Europe, for example, error ratio metric increased from 0 to 2.1%. And this might be like a ratio of 500 to 200 response calls. If it doesn't recover over the next few minutes, it will ping us again and say, my checks are failing too much, I'm rolling it back, because error ratio in this site continued to increase. Hopefully, though, that doesn't happen, and we get that everything is green, all the metrics remained at 0%, and we continue to roll it out. So that brings us to the deployment stage. So once the Canary Analysis Service concluded that Canary group is doing fine, it automatically starts deploying poster canaries or to all the pods in production. And like I said, we want this to be really fast. So the Canary Analysis Service doesn't run that long, just long enough to give us some level of confidence that it doesn't break. And of course, it's already passed the tests. So the turnaround time from merging the code to being it in production is, as I said, from 15 to 20 minutes. But at the same time, the turnaround time from merging to realizing that the code you merged is broken should be much less than that. And you would have to do some manual intervention only after the Canary Analysis Service will tell you that, okay, something broken, I made everything safe, I rolled back, now you should go and look manually, whatever broke, whatever went wrong. Of course, sometimes this doesn't work. Sometimes things slip through testing, and maybe upstream breaks. Then, of course, if things break in production, it gets a little bit more serious. We have obviously constant alerts. Somebody is always on call for each of the team, for the services we own. We have detailed metrics for the services that we own. And this isn't even the last stage of the testing, because we make very heavy use of A/B testing framework. So this might be as simple as, I want to check that this small, simple refactoring is okay. What I would normally do is, I want to deploy it to the whole production group of the pods, and it will be hidden behind the flag. And the flag is initially set to 0%, for example. And I will slowly increase the percentage, constantly monitoring the metrics to see if this is the change I'm worried about or not. But of course, if there will be problems, then it gets more serious, because you are affecting real users in this case. So then, of course, when it's too late, you would probably do something to make everything safe as fast as possible. And this normally implies a rollback. And of course, you might be woken up in the middle of the night because of something, if something is really broken. Okay, so in this talk, I talked about two things: some history overview of Spotify, and also I described how we do deploys in my team. Thank you very much, and I'm super happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? No question? Yep.
So, how many deployments a day are you doing?
It depends.
On average?
I don't have a number right now. Sometimes it's 5, 10 for a service, if we are doing some active work on a feature. It really depends. Yeah, actually, should I repeat the question so everybody hears? So the question was how we handle multiple versions going into production at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So we normally try to avoid this because if it's a microservice, you can afford to wait 15 minutes before making another deploy. So we try to, as a team, we try to negotiate whatever comes first. So the question is, if I'm on call, how many calls do I get per week? For my team, it's very low. Last time I was woken up was probably half a year ago. It depends between Spotify teams, so it differs a lot.
You describe yourself as an infrastructure team. The capability that you have, is this specialized in your team, or would you say that all of the teams delivering features have the same capability that you are talking about in their own teams, or are you doing this on behalf of others?
So the question is the pipeline, I mean, we use for delivering differs from other Spotify teams, right?
Yeah, I mean, is there somebody like you doing what you
Yep.
do in every team, or are you doing this on behalf of a large group?
Yeah, good question. So we kind of responsible for a particular service, so we are focused on this service. But we have common infrastructure and common ways to do things. So lately we made it more shared, I would say. So many other teams do it similar way. And we try to make it more and more robust and similar to each other, so people know how the whole Spotify works instead of knowing how just my team works and doing things.
Yeah, I've got a similar question. So I was at a client and they were following a Spotify culture. Is the culture at Spotify still following the Conway's law with anchors and captains? Or do you still do that? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so the question is the Spotify culture with captains and everything still alive? I think what you mean is more like squads.
Squads, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, that's alive. So yeah, I was calling it a team, but internally we call it a squad.
Okay. Good.
Hmm?
In Spotify Connect, you don't have staging environment. Is that true just for your team or for all the teams in Spotify? General rule?
The question is no staging environment the rule for just our team or for the whole Spotify? I can't say for everyone, but I don't know teams who use staging environments. I'm pretty sure there are some use cases for it, but not that I'm aware of.
For the system test example, with A, B, C, D, how much do you have to know the relationship between those services to run those integration tests?
The question is how much do we need to know the relations between different services to run system tests? That's a very good point. Ideally, if you want to run a real system test, of course it will eventually imply running all integration tests on Spotify. Of course we can't afford this, that just doesn't scale. So I think we are talking about under 10 services. And of course we know that it's an assumption that some border between our services and some other services can't break. Of course it can, but we assume that the risk is very low.
When you're actually making these changes or deciding on them, is there some limit as to how big a change can be, how much it can involve, the impact it can have?
Which change did?
You've got lots of little changes being progressed very, very, very quickly. But if there's a lot that needs to be changed in a system, you say that has to be broken down because of some limit into small packets, or do you have different amounts of content?
So the question is how would we deploy big changes?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Of course, the common way to do it is to break changes as much as possible to smaller ones because it has a lot of benefits. You reduce the risk it's easier to roll back. And but I agree with your point, sometimes it's just not possible. So then you would have to go back to manual deploys, but I don't remember we ever done it. But I can imagine there might be a case where it actually needed.
One last question, and that's it. Sorry, this one.
What do you guys use to build infrastructure as code?
Puppet? Sorry, I need to repeat the question. What do we do? What do we use for infrastructure as a code? And we use Puppet.
A couple of questions.
Okay, go on.
How coupled are your pipelines with the tooling? So if tomorrow you decide to move from Jenkins, why move to smart tooling?
For Jenkins specific, sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the question. How up-to-date our pipelines are with tooling like Jenkins? We have special teams who own this, and they are updating things as it should be. Of course, I can't say that it's always up-to-date. It's usually up-to-date for security-wise, so we close all the security problems. Yeah.
We'll be hanging around afterwards. If you've got any more questions, come and find them.
Yep.
I'm sure we'll be happy to answer them. But yeah, thanks a lot again, Slava. We've got a break now for 15 minutes. Grab another drink, and then we'll start again.
Thank you.
works at WorldPay itself, 100 days of SRE.
Can you hear me okay? Is the mic working? Okay, good. So I wasn't sure whether it was a good thing or not to have to do the talk twice. I thought, oh well, you know, it gives me a chance to have a practice session. But it also has meant that I've started losing my voice. So, you know, pros and cons. Hi, welcome to WorldPay. I don't think I need to talk about fire alarm, but in case they haven't told you already, if you haven't and you want to find more about WorldPay, you can register at that URL. Okay, so hello, my name is Mark. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, just to give you some context. So I started life as a developer, but I worked at small companies in the telecoms and mobile industries. So I ended up having to do a bit of everything, ops, DBA, technical account management, you know, managing email servers, all of the stuff that happens at a small company. I then spent a long time at a company called Net-a-Porter, more recently Ukes Net-a-Porter. I don't know if there's anyone from that NAP here today. Some of you may be familiar with it because we used to employ a lot of DevOps engineers. So I managed ops teams under various guises through a number of different transformations through the sort of DevOps journey and through a period of rapid growth and organizational change. So just to give you some spoilers, I'm quite new to WorldPay. I've only been here for about 100 days. I was brought in to set up a brand new SRE function. So when I was asked to do this talk, I was like, thanks Richie for that. I was like, what am I going to talk about? I haven't really done anything interesting yet. But I thought, well, actually, coming into a new role and setting up a new function in an organisation which perhaps it isn't familiar with these kind of practices is quite an interesting challenge in itself. So I thought I'd talk about that. So it's not really technical, but it is in the context of SRE. Hopefully you'll get some value from it. A bit about WorldPay. So it's been around for a while. It was founded in '97. I think it was partnered with NatWest and then was part of RBS. RBS had to sell it back in about a decade ago when they needed some cash. And then more recently we were bought by Vantiv and then again by FIS Global, who are a large global financial company. So we're now the merchant services division of FIS, which is very exciting. Basically, we provide online and point-of-sale payment service. So just to give you an idea of the scale, we service over 1 million merchants, process more than 40 billion transactions annually, support 300 payment types, and operate across 146 countries and 126 currencies. So you get an idea of the scale because we've been around for a while. We were part of a bank. The numbers are quite serious, which means obviously reliability is absolutely key. But also having been around for a while, perhaps there's some, as you can imagine, a lot of legacy tech which got us to where we are, but perhaps isn't serving the business as well as it. There's more money to integrate with Amazon Pay, I think, and also Apple Pay. We've got lots of other sexy clients, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed to mention them or not, so I thought I'd play it safe. So, the part of WorldPay that I work for is called the New Acquiring Platform. So having come from Net-a-Porter, which is always abbreviated to NAP, I'm now working for the New Acquiring Platform, which is also abbreviated to NAP, which makes it very confusing when I'm trying to talk about like different parts of my career. But basically, the New Acquiring Platform processes all the payments. It's a significant percentage of the UK high street, to the point where if our systems go goes down, it impacts GDP. Basically, in a nutshell, the acquiring platform gets all of the card transactions and then settles the amounts between the card issuers and the merchants via the schemes, which are Visa, MasterCard, and so on. Sounds simple. It's really not. Different integrations with the different partners, which makes it very complicated. So it's a pipeline-based application as opposed to a sort of request-based application, which was a bit different for me, having come from a web shop, but more about that later. It was originally built around some enterprise technologies, things like Oracle ODI, IBM WebLogic, but we started to hit some challenges around the flexibility and the speed of delivery, and also the company. There are some dependencies. The fairly large enterprise solutions into smaller components, microservices where applicable, using open source technologies, utilizing cloud, automating releases, all of the stuff that needs to happen for a company to be able to deliver for its clients quickly in this day and age and stay ahead of the competition. As well as changing the move to create cross-functional autonomous teams, so to remove the dependencies, excuse me, so you can speed up delivery, and to create a new SRE function within engineering to support all of that, which is where I come in. Luckily, I didn't have to start from scratch. I was a little bit worried, but Rashi, who I'll introduce later, has been managing the DevOps team here for a few years now. So has done a lot of the groundwork in terms of the automation. People are already thinking in this way and have started to see what's possible. I can then build on that. So I'm not starting from scratch. So what is SRE? So I kind of thought everyone knew. Should never make assumptions. What I realized coming into a new organization, everybody's got very different ideas around what it really means. And although you can quote the sort of high-level definition in place for okay, so for those of you that haven't, the idea is that SRE isn't exactly different from DevOps, but good DevOps practices. If you haven't read those books, I really strongly recommend that you do. Even if you're not working in the ops space, anybody working in tech will benefit from reading those books. They give you a really good insight into the experience at Google. So what does that really mean in detail? So there's lots of things that come out of those books. Some of the key things is, whereas DevOps is a bit of a fluffy term, and it could be, you could have developers who do DevOps, and then release engineering is kind of DevOps, and then automated operations is DevOps. So what SRE does is it recognizes that really the ops skill set and ops experience is generally different from developers. Obviously, we all love to have cross-functional engineers who can do everything, but in general, people focus on one area, and that's where their expertise is. And SRE recognizes that. However, at the same time, the key tenet is to reduce silos, and you do that through shared ownership. So rather than one team owning the code, the developers, and the ops team owning the production systems, both teams work together, owning the complete solution and agreeing how it should work in production and supporting each other. That's really key. Another key principle from the Google book is the concept of SLOs and SLIs. So for those of you who aren't familiar with those acronyms, Rather than SLAs, which tends to be a legal agreement that you might have with your customer around your quality of service, an SLO is an objective that you agree across all of the various players, so ops, development, and the business, in terms of what tells you that your systems are running well, and what's the threshold where if things aren't running well, you need to stop and do something about it. SLIs it stands for service level indicator, so those are the actual metrics that you would agree on, which then feed into your SLOs. So, obviously we all know it's useful to see how your systems are running, but actually thinking around how you bring the different teams together, having that common benchmark of 50%, you shouldn't be doing any more than 50% reactive work. But we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. You have to sort of understand the infrastructure, perhaps more than a developer might. Depending on your organization, you may or may not be responsible entirely for the infrastructure. In a larger organization, it makes sense to have other teams who are focused on that. But you need to have that understanding, you need to understand how to engage so that you can be that sort of conduit between development and infrastructure. Effective PIRs or postmortems, I don't know, there's probably other things that gets called in different organizations, but the follow-up of incidents, so when something goes wrong, getting the right people together and having effective analysis of what went wrong. And it has to be blameless, it has to be transparent, and you have to have effective actions that come off the back of that. And that's the only way that you're going to improve reliability. And there's lots more, so read the books. I'm not going to recite the whole thing. Having said all that, then face and decide what to do, there's quite a lot to think about, to pick out of all of that stuff. So I like to distill it into 3 objectives, which are obviously improving reliability, the clue's in the title, but you also have to work to increase velocity. Obviously, in the old days, ops would keep things reliable by not letting anybody change anything in production, and that doesn't work for a business. And then at the same time, you have to work to reduce toil, because if you just have more and more people doing more and more manual stuff, it's not sustainable. And help was a new challenge for me. So I thought I'd talk a bit about some of the experience I had. Obviously, the first thing you need to do is discover. You've got to find out what's going on, what the challenges are, what the world looks like. And in order to do that, you really have to build trust. So before you decide, start sort of getting into the technicalities, you've got to get to know people and take the time to understand things from their point of view, understand their view on the world, the bit of the history, so that you can collaborate with them, because otherwise you're toast, basically. It's kind of obvious, but it's really easy to do, is to make assumptions. So, as I said, based on my previous challenges, I was very focused on automation when I came in, and actually that's not the problem here. As I said, Rashi's team have already done a lot of great work on that side. But there was new challenges which were things I was familiar with but sort of hadn't expected. So you really have to just start from scratch, keep an open mind. Then of course you have to make a plan. You need to very quickly decide what are you going to do, what are you going to target first, how are you going to go about that, and more importantly than the plan is you've got to communicate the plan. And it may be that you have to do a presentation to senior management or just get engagement from your colleagues, but you've really got to talk to people and explain what you want to do and why you want to do it and get that buy-in. Because you can't do anything on your own, right? And obviously everybody's always very keen on strategy and being strategic, which is really important, and we could have a whole talk about that. But as a strong agile proponent, it was very important to deliver some value quickly, which is not that easy when you're coming in somewhere new. So, what could I do to help? The first thing I did, well, the first objective I had was to build a team. So there's a quote from there's a book by a guy called Jim Collins, who wrote a book called Good to Great, where he did a lot of sort of analysis and interviews with CTOs of not just successful companies, but companies that had been failing and that these guys turned around. And one of the common traits that these guys had was that one of the most important things was to get the right people in. If you get the right people on the bus, then you decide where to go. So I think having managed teams for a number of years, I can really understand that mindset. People are absolutely key. So in order to hire effectively, you can apply SRE principles to hiring. So you want to streamline the process as much as possible, remove all of the dependencies and all of the manual processes. Again, you can use the sort of the Unix mindset of using the right tool for the job. So if you're going to use an agency, find an agency who understands the industry, understands the technology. So there's obviously Linux Recruit, a very, very expert in this space, but there's other agencies too. I don't know who else is here. But it's really important to work with people that understand what you need, and you need to understand the market. Obviously, skills that you guys have are in demand, and you have to be prepared to compete with all the other employers that are trying to employ those people. Luckily, WorldPay isn't short of a bob or two, so the compensation's quite good. But it's important, right? And then finally, when you're hiring somebody, you need to tell a compelling story. So you can't pretend things are different to they are. So you need to talk about the challenges that are there, but you need to frame it in a way that makes it seem like an interesting challenge for somebody to come and help with. So that was the first thing. The second area that I concentrated on in an effort to add value quickly was around reducing toil. So actually at WorldPay, we have a separate support function that does it runs the systems in production, does a lot of absorbs some of the manual processes, and stays up overnight to deal with things when they go wrong, which is great. It's a bit of a luxury, but it can mean that you get a bit of a disconnect between the developers and how their software is running in production, right? So the manual tasks build up, and then you can get into an overload situation. And that's actually really hard to get out of, because once people are firefighting all the time, then they don't have the time, the headspace to figure out what they need to do to pay down that technical debt and get back to a sort of normal state. So the first thing to do is identify that that's a problem, and you need to communicate it to everybody, that it needs to be a top-level initiative to face into it and tackle it. And one of the first things you need to do is be able to measure that measure the toil, measure the incidents, and make it visible. So as soon as everybody can see exactly how much manual work is being done, it's much easier then to have the conversations around what you prioritize to pay down that tech debt. Once you made it visible, you need to get the different actors to collaborate to figure out how to fix this stuff or how to automate it. And what often happens is everybody's very busy, they're working in their own world, and while everybody wants to achieve the same things, they perhaps don't really understand the other guy's view of the world. So actively facilitating that communication between the different teams and supporting that collaboration is something you need to do as a manager. And actually by doing that, it really helped to start fixing the problems. But it's not a one-off, right? You need to put the processes in place to make sure that things don't get back to that state. So, and once you put that process in place, you need to keep reviewing it to make sure that it's working. And then finally, well, not finally, but the last of the sort of 3 key areas that I attempted to tackle in my first 100 days was around monitoring. So monitoring is kind of one of my, I'm loath to say passion, but it's something that I really care about. I've seen what difference it makes. I've worked in ops, I've worked in support, so I know the difference that good monitoring makes. I can't remember who said it, but there's a famous business quote that you can't manage what you can't measure, and that's really true. We talked a little bit about SLIs and SLOs. So what was interesting here is that being a pipeline application, actually the way that you measure the health of the platform and the reliability is quite different to like if you're running a website. So you're running a website, you want to know that how many people got errors, how quickly the page loaded, is it down? Whereas for a data pipeline platform, there's other things you need to think about, like the freshness of the data. So did stuff get handled in a timely fashion? The correctness. So if the data was transformed, was enough of the outcome correct? And coverage. Did enough of the data get processed? So that was a bit of a different mindset, but it was quite interesting. And we were able to quite quickly set up some dashboards which really helped to see where the bottlenecks were. Another thing to think about is, when you're monitoring a system, really the metrics are the most important thing. The monitoring here previously was sort of event-based, so something would happen, it would fire off an alert, which is fine, but perhaps then you don't have all of the context. So I'd say if you're thinking about monitoring, focus on the metrics first. Alerts may be one outcome of that. In order to quickly improve the monitoring, the challenge I was faced with is there's a number of different approaches, and being new, I didn't really know which one was going to come to fruition first. So I tried all 3. And that is to leverage the existing tools and perhaps get them working a bit better, be a bit more self-service. Pay somebody else for your monitoring. So there's companies like Datadog, which you can very easily get a lot of value, but you've got to pay for it. Or obviously build your own. There's a lot of well-known open source monitoring tools that you can implement yourself. Whereas perhaps normally you might not want to take on the additional maintenance overhead of building your own. Actually, here it was quite a useful way to build something quickly, but also to find out more around the existing processes, the infrastructure, this kind of thing. Okay, so I think I'm over time slightly, so sorry about that. Just wanted to introduce some other key people who you may have met already. We've got Rashi, who's the head of DevOps in NAP, Richie, who's head of development or head of NAP services, and Hardeep, our recruitment partner, and Eamon's there as well. Sorry, Eamon, I didn't get a photo. But, so if you haven't already said hi, go and say hi to them, ask them questions. We are hiring. If you want to find out more, you can email that email. That's it.
No?
Nothing
at all?
Everybody wants to go to the pub.
Sure.
Good. But before you go, though, because I want to always improve, how many of you found that useful or interesting? Okay, more than the other place. That's really good. I've improved. So, great. Thanks, guys.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Big round of applause to the WorldPay team for putting this on. Thanks to Mark and Stava. Next event is the 25th of Feb, so get it in your diary. We're back at Sainsbury's. So, yeah, see you there. And also the pub is left and then left again. It's just there.